Welcome to those of you online and all one, two of you in person. So when I originally built the topic ideas for this presentation series, I called this presentation Production by the Numbers. And as I was building it, I'm just like, that's a stupid place for a topic like that. Who's the person that decided to put this topic where it is? And I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm the idiot that put this topic where it is. So I changed it a little bit to be mission people. The first half of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit, we'll kind of recap some of the stuff that we've talked about before. If anybody has missed any of the previous talks, you have a chance to kind of get caught up here, but we're really going to look at how the mission hasn't changed. And in the second half, we're going to try kind of bridge the gap between the establishment of Rock Island Arsenal and World War I. So, oh yes, that's right. I have to click back to the presentation. Here we go. There we go. So first things first, Arsenal is open. If you do not have a visitor's pass, which I know you don't, I encourage you to go and get a new visitor's pass. It takes about 15-20 minutes to do, and then you have access to pretty much the entire island. Those of you who are listening at home or watching on YouTube, you can scan that barcode on there. That'll give you all the information that you need to visit Rock Island Arsenal and also have yourself a grand self-guided tour. There's about 60 points that we have listed on those tours. So with all that out of the way, let's dive right in. I'm cutting for time a little bit tonight, but that's okay. Let's start with something that I've always found very interesting. When I first came to Army Sustainment Command, the commanding general at the time had a very pointed interest in changing the signs to Rock Island Arsenal. Those of us that are in the area, we know that if you go to Rock Island Arsenal, you'll see the big U.S. Army signboards out there, and then underneath it, it says producing Army readiness since 1862. Okay, yeah, but when did we start doing Army readiness? Was it 1862? Was it 1832? Was it 1814? Was it 1816? So there's a lot of blurred lines for when that actually started. As we've kind of talked through in this lecture, we've been doing a lot of different things here at Rock Island, but a couple of things that I want to point out here. During the War of 1812, we utilized contractors and sutlers to supply an army. And I'm really going to lay into the contractors part because contractors come up a lot in Rock Island history. During the run of Fort Armstrong, it was a staging point. So there was sustaining and training and supplies were going out from Fort Armstrong. Black Hawk War, again, sustaining and having the logistics to move material over large distances of land to support an army that was actually in the field. Natural land and fortifications, so there's stuff here that we can use to make things, to build things, and we can provide security or medical support. And then, of course, or did it become mission ready only after Congress establishes an arsenal in 1862. But some of the things here, and I don't have my little cheat sheets here with me, is that we focus a lot on training, contracting, sustainment, production, and garrison support, which is basic garrison support is anything that has to do with maintaining a standing installation or base, so your amenities and things like that. So here we have that, and coincidentally, we have 5 commands today that seem to fit the role. And I have to be careful mentioning anything having to do with First Army because the First Army historian is here. And I don't need to have that conversation. But we have training, which you could make the reach and establish it with First Army. Contracting, we have Army Contracting Command at Rock Island Arsenal today. Of course, Army Sustainment Command for logistics. Installation Management Command for garrison, and Tank and Automotive Command for industry. So mission has really been the same since 1814. mostly, with some minor altercations and things like that through. But I'm going to whirlwind through some of these. We'll take a look at some of these really quick, and then we'll jump over into some of the newer content as we go forward here. But really the emphasis here is that the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And that's really kind of true here at Rock Island. So first things forward, we'll talk a little bit about the Battle of the Rock Island Rapids, because that's kind of where contracting starts. So during the Battle of the Rock Island Rapids, there are sutlers that are traveling with the U.S. Army. There are sutlers up at Prairie du Chien, and there are contracted soldiers that are actually with the standing army going up to Prairie du Chien. The navigators were actually French contractors that were with the U.S. Army going up the Mississippi River. And so really the first time that we see anything with contracting comes out of the War of 1812 and the Battle of the Rock Island Rapids. By the time we get to 1816, of course, we have Colonel George Davenport, who is a sutler at Fort Armstrong. Coincidentally, just so happens, we happen to have a city here named Davenport. I'm sure there's no connection, but so we do have Davenport in 1816 comes here. He's going to be a beloved individual. He's going to stay here for the duration of his life until he's eventually murdered in 1845. But long-standing individual in the area. So for those of you who don't understand what a sutler is, basically sutler is an individual who facilitates trade between two parties. So normally it's I don't want to say it's a non-vested entity, but it is somebody who is kind of a third party acting to establish and make sure that trade is equitable between two parties. Now, contractors also provide labor for the first arsenal building in 1862. What is not mentioned on here as well is that there is contract labor coming in for the railroad bridge as well in 1856. And then, of course, when we get the core of the arsenal built between 1868 and 1897, those are also contracted workers using contracted material to build stone shops. So there are a lot of things, and contracting has been come up quite a bit when we talk about Rock Island Arsenal. Moving on to logistics and sustainment. We'll talk a little bit about the Black Hawk War here. So this picture is actually of the crossing near Bad Axe. So this is near where the battlefield was. Fort Armstrong sustains and supports and pushes out materiel for about 20% of the U.S. Army during the Black Hawk War of 1832. We talked about that in pretty decent amount of depth, but it required logistics and manpower to be pushed out across pretty much all of northern Illinois and all the southern half of Wisconsin. So it's a very large area, especially when you consider what navigation looked like. And this is just a smaller map of one of the larger maps that we use up here in the corner, depicting what the navigation routes are. Now, those of us that live in this area know pretty much what the terrain is like in between this diamond of arrows here. It is a marshy mess. Now, I've had a vehicle go through Nahan. It's not fun going through Nahan in a car, in a sedan. It's even less fun going through it in a wagon. So it's very difficult to move material. So the waterways are extremely important. But another thing to remember about the waterways is that you're using these keel boats that just really don't move a lot. And we're getting steam power by the time we get into 1862. But the early navigation that they're using are keel boats. So just not a lot of movement forward. It takes a lot of time still. To give you an idea of how long it takes, I pulled this out here. So this is the importance of transportation. 285 miles from St. Louis to Rock Island, 155 miles from Rock Island to Prairie du Chien. So that's the northern extent of U.S. Army presence pretty much at the time. So a total of 440 miles. And on a really good day, you would get 10 miles out of the keel boat a day going up the river. So 44 days, ideally, to move anything from St. Louis to Prairie du Chien. And that is if everything is going in your favor. And 9 times out of 10, when you came through the Des Moines Rapids down near Keokuk, Iowa, or you came through the Rock Island Rapids near here, things weren't going to go so well. So an absolute ridiculous amount of time to go over these areas. So that's another thing that we managed to figure out very well here, is an ability to actually push material out quickly to sustaining forces during the Black Hawk War. Jumping to garrison support. So our first installation here, Fort Armstrong, we've talked about that quite a bit. It did have a sutler, which was Colonel Davenport, as I mentioned. There was a mess hall, there was an infirmary, there were barracks. So these are all basic amenities of an installation of any variety, or a fort or anything, what have you. And these are all present here at Rock Island as early as 1816. So we've established this baseline even as early as the early 19th century. So flash forward just a little bit further, we get support of the prison barracks from 1863 through 65, which was a very large prison barracks. To give you an idea too of how much we've needed to adapt with this, I believe Kevin talked in his Civil War presentation about the smallpox outbreak. Those of us who were also here during the winter of 2019, we remember how cold it got. -29, -32 air temp, -56 wind chill. Well, imagine you're a boy from Kentucky, you've got smallpox, and you just got dumped in Rock Island during the same cold spell. And the only thing between you and God pretty much is a pair of really thin clothes and a slab of wood, pretty much. Chances are you're not in for a really great time. When the surgeon comes here, the establishment is to establish pest houses away from the rest of the camp and to move where you're burying people to away from the camp as well. The prison barracks rapidly adapted to this, and rather quickly we were able to turn around the smallpox outbreak that we had at Rock Island. But it was only after surgeon intervention. So, but again, just to show those different kind of services and support that we had to have on hand early. Next point, material and industrial power. This one's kind of weird just because you don't really see it a whole bunch until the arsenal, but even still, before the arsenal is here in 1856, we do have the first bridge to cross the river, and there is industry and production that is required for that. Now, as we go forward a little bit, we do know that the first time that the arsenal actually does anything for production is in 1865. There are pieces that will run through the arsenal for the Civil War right towards the end. So, and Rodman writes that there was about 55,000 pieces, about 500 pieces of artillery. We'll take a look at those here in a little bit. So it is something that does exist, but repurpose of the artillery depot for building materials. This is something that's significant that comes up for building the arsenal, in that we basically recycle everything that's already here. So one of the things that I'd also like to point out about the early history at Rock Island is we were kind of a progressive installation. We were doing things before it was modern to do things. So we talk about recycling here. We were very good at recycling material. Later, we're going to talk about female employees. We were utilizing female employees in skilled labor positions much earlier than the rest of the War Department was. Now, about 1914, the arsenal had experience making things like carriages, gun tubes, rifles, saddles, and other things such as canteens, meat cans, utensils. There were things like ammo pouches, stirrups, so much more. There was a lot of material that was getting pushed out by the arsenal during this time frame. And the First Army bit. So training. If Fort Armstrong was indeed designed to be a staging point for the Black Hawk War and monitoring the local tribes that were towards the west, inevitably there would have been some sense of training regiment that was involved. And again, training is a thing that we see by at least 1830 at Fort Armstrong. But most of what we see when it comes to training maneuvers shows up probably in the 1890s and early 1900s, when we see things like Rock Island Arsenal putting out things about equipment boards. So we'll see the 1910 and 1912 equipment boards, which we'll talk about here shortly. There's a lot of testing to make sure that what we're making is practical. So we'll see various things like, this is just for instance, but we'll see soldiers that are actually being tested in different environments and different locations on the arsenal. Generally, where the tank test track is today would have been where a lot of that is actually taking place. But one of the more important things when it comes to training actually has nothing to do necessarily with the Army itself, but with the Army's what we call the organic industrial base. So skilled labor. You have to have a lot of skilled workers that are very, very talented and have a very particular set of skills, like the Liam Neeson movie. And they have to be trained and educated on how to run machinery and make things in a certain way and understand the process. So skilled labor is also another key factor when it comes into training at Rock Island Arsenal. And indeed, skilled labor is where Rock Island Arsenal almost drops its edge between World War I and World War II. But we'll talk about that during the next presentation. But in particular, an individual by the name of Bombeck is one of the single individuals that actually saves Rock Island from going down a path where it would not have been prepared for World War II. And it all ties back into skilled labor, in the training for skilled labor. The last bit on the recap, I promise, it's the last one on the recap. So we talk about readiness, and I'm going to poke a little bit of fun here at Zachary Taylor, because as we remember with Zachary Taylor kind of, had to turn tail just a little bit because he was outnumbered and outgunned by far at the Battle of the Rock Island Rapids. So 1814, as I got here, is a poor depiction of readiness. But by the time we get to 1816, the U.S. Army is thinking that, hey, we might have a problem in this area. We do need to have military control in this area. We are going to establish a fort at Rock Island. So we do have Fort Armstrong that's established. But because of how Fort Armstrong is postured, where it's located, it is able to, again, project that force outward and upward, extending beyond and past Prairie du Chien, beyond what the War of 1812 had actually shown that we would have been capable of projecting at that time. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. In addition to that, there is a depot that's kept on Rock Island after Fort Armstrong is kind of left by the wayside. But the pre-positioning of that material also makes it so that when the arsenal commander does come in and decide, hey, we've got a bunch of stuff here that we can use, it's there. Now, one thing too, I'm going to go back here just a little bit. This is one of my favorite pictures depicting, or drawings depicting Rock Island Arsenal. And this is the ideal of what Rock Island Arsenal is supposed to be. So we like to talk an awful lot about the stone shops, but what we never really talk about are the storehouses. So we have the wonderful 10 stone shops that are depicted here, Arsenal Row and Armory Row, but in the original plan that Rodman laid out, there were also 10 warehouses that were lined behind the stone shops. Now, unfortunately, only 3 of those get built, and one of them succumbs to what I call the Rock Island curse, and the Rock Island curse is it burned down. There's a lot of fire in the history of Rock Island Arsenal in some shape, way, or form, whether it's Fort Armstrong burning down, or Major Kingsbury setting fire to Harper's Ferry, or the fire at the old sewer house, or the fire at the power plant. There's lots of fire. Everything's on fire. Everything's burning, and carnage and everything like that. But just something to kind of keep in mind. Yes.
What's the era of that woodcut, or whatever the picture is?
1880s, thereabout, 80s into about 1900, somewhere right in that time frame. So let's talk about what things look like pre-Arsenal. Again, this is kind of the whirlwind here, just to kind of recant on this. And some of this is just to make sure that I didn't forget anything. That's what this slide is actually here for. I'm not going to lie to you. So we have the Fort Armstrong era, 1814 to 1836. Then we have the bridge era, the 45 to 56, where we get the bridge that comes through finally. So now we've got rail that's servicing the area, as well as river and foot traffic. Then we get the prison camp, which Rock Island Arsenal is a natural location for that, mainly because you have rail that can bring the prisoners right here. There's a river surrounding it, so nobody's really going to want to escape all that much. And then finally, we get to the Arsenal era, where we're utilizing existing resources. And I actually tied in this one last piece here. On our self-guided tours, we also have this Rock Island Arsenal local effort for a global mission. We'll talk about that a little bit more here shortly, but I want to kind of emphasize the first time this makes an appearance and is really kind of driven home is in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. And we'll talk about what that global mission and what that local effort was here in just a minute. Real quick here, though, the Civil War, again, there was a big issue with struggling for material. So not only was the prison camp making adjustments, but the arsenal was making adjustments and making do. So there's a very limited amount of resources that Major Kingsbury has access to, as we've talked about. And one of the things that he will eventually have to do is he'll have to argue for manpower to actually build the stone shop. So it's not just the prison camp that's making adaptations at this time. Kingsbury is also actively making changes to his grand plan as well. So there are three individuals that I cite as kind of the fathers of Rock Island Arsenal. We talk all the time about Colonel Rodman. And Rodman is the one that came up with the idea. I've divided this just recently, just in the last few days even, to tell you how recently I've kind of drafted this division out. You have a visionary that has the idea, that's Rodman. You have the person that builds the idea, and then you have the one that executes it. We're going to talk about the other two tonight, because we always hear about Rodman, but we're going to talk about the other two. So the man that takes the idea and builds it is this man, Daniel W. Flagler, who is the third commander of the Rock Island Arsenal. So he takes over after Rodman passes in June of 1871. And he's born in New York in 1835. He goes to the U.S. Academy, Military Academy in 1861. And he gets commissioned on 3 August. And he will see things similar to Rodman. He's going to end up being have some breveted rank there. He'll get a breveted lieutenant colonel rank in 1865. But what I want to point out here is when he comes to Rock Island, he's a captain. He takes command of Rock Island Arsenal as a captain. He's not a major. We tend to cite him as Major Flagler or Colonel Flagler, but he does spend a few short period, about a year or so as a captain before he will, papers will read off and okay, you're a major. Eventually he'll post up into major, lieutenant colonel, and he'll eventually make it to brigadier general, which he will retain for the rest of his life because he will unfortunately pass away in 1899. As mentioned here, 15 June 1871, he comes to Rock Island from Augusta Arsenal. He'll be the Arsenal commander for almost 15 years. So he has a very long tenure here. And then he transfers to Frankfurt and then Watertown. After that, he becomes the chief of ordnance. But what I have described with Flagler is that he is all about Rock Island. Once he comes here, he's in love with it. And he's not so in love with it that, he comes back necessarily. But if you look at what he does and how he interacts with Rock Island, he really does kind of have this soft spot in his heart for Rock Island. So one of the cool things for my office is that Flagler here is the first Rock Island Arsenal historian. Flagler is the one that first puts up a history of Rock Island Arsenal, takes it all the way back to 1804, brings it all the way up to present. And then on top of that, he starts to chronicle his own experiences at Rock Island. There is actually a text where he includes his memo that he sent off to the chief of ordnance when he was in command at the arsenal, saying, we are immediately making the bridge open to pedestrians, whether you like it or not. So Flagler is very much interested in Rock Island Arsenal on the whole. He's also the one that is in command during the majority of the modernization of Rock Island Arsenal from when it was just Storehouse A to the stone shops. So the stone shops are constructed through about 1890, right in that time frame, and he's here until 86. So he's overseeing almost all the stone shop building. He's also here when the Iron Bridge is opened. He's the reason that the Iron Bridge is not just for government use, it's now also for pedestrian use. And before he leaves, he's also the one that says, we are going to need an improved bridge at some point, very soon. So he's always got Rock Island on the mind, and when he becomes chief of ordnance too, he's actually going to be the one that recommends Rock Island be the location for a modernization of machinery for arsenal production. Now, jumping into Rock Island and the Spanish-American War, that is not a picture of Rock Island in the Spanish-American War. That is Rock Island circa interwar, about 1925, but just imagine, all right, like cut the bottom half, yeah, right off in half. So this modernization project, I know those of you who are here can't see this because it says that I'm talking up here, but there's a modernization project that's already in the works by the early 1890s. Flagler has initiated that as chief of ordnance. Finally, by about 9 March 1898, the arsenal switches into wartime production mode after war is declared with Spain. Now, something to keep in mind is just prior to this, Chief of Ordnance at the time basically says, hey, you guys should I want you guys to know that it is currently like 1 March, and I want all the stuff that you guys have that's supposed to be done by the end of the year, I want it done by last week. So manpower increases to about 608 by 31 March. Quickly, it goes up. And Colonel Blunt is actually the one who is in charge at the time. He is going to be the one that is going to kind of push the arsenal and test whether or not it's actually capable of keeping up with wartime production. That figure in manpower does not go down. It will go down into the hundreds again, but it doesn't fall below this level of 608 ever again. An order for 25,000 complete sets of infantry equipment expanded to 75,000 plus 10,000 cavalry sets. And orders continued to a point where demand was so high that contracting agencies were brought in because Rock Island Arsenal had to contract the work out to other agencies. Again, contracting being a big operative word here. So 46 agencies were contracted through Rock Island by July, and employment finally reaches a high of 2,900 in August. And at the peak, they are putting out 6,000 sets of infantry kits per day. So an absolute ridiculous amount of stuff, especially when you consider that the peak production prior to this was during the Civil War, and they were putting out 55,000 total for the duration of the war. So this is an example of one of the modernized interiors. This is 1904, but there wasn't a lot that changed in the interiors at this point. This still shows the old teledynamic system in place. It was not being used by and large at this point. A lot of this stuff had been modernized to where the belts and pulley system was not needed. For those of you who aren't familiar though, this is an example of the equipment sets that these soldiers here are wearing, 1898-ish era. A little bit more for the Spanish War. So total overall, there were 131 contractors that got involved. There were approximately about 500 rifles that were serviced per day by 85 individuals. 50,000 rifles were worked on and completed. Now, this is particularly significant because as you see in the bottom point there, outstanding performance led to the Arsenal to acquire the 1903 project in 1904. It's largely because of the success with rifles that this comes into the forefront of the War Department's mind. This is where we're going to have the 1903 program have an additional location. So Springfield being the main location, Rock Island becomes a secondary location in 1904. We'll talk about that in a second. Up to 7,000 bayonet scabbards per day. All that's out of the leather works. Plenty of gun carriages, such as these 3-inch guns that I've had somebody pull up here. So plenty of 3-inch guns. The workforce, as I mentioned, does not return to the pre-Span Am Warner levels. It just does not do that afterwards. Now, the demand for how much is going through the arsenal is so high that there needs to be an upgrade in power. We're using a lot of water power, the teledynamic system, all through Span Am War. By the time we get into the 1900s, aside from the fact that a fire burns something down, because fire is what we do best, we actually will upgrade the power plant at Rock Island Arsenal even more. And as always, there's a lawsuit that follows that because we upgraded the capacity of the hydroelectric power dam, but we won't get into that too terribly much. But basically, we convert things into a more hydroelectric rather than a teledynamic system by the time we get into the 1900s. Flagler, right there, orders modernization of the armories at Rock Island, which fully fulfills the plan that Rodman had for the arsenal. So between Blunt, Flagler, and Rodman, this is where the arsenal really comes into play, where it really gets all of its tools to become what it becomes today. It all stems out of this, this one point in time. Now, keeping in mind the 1903 program, it is one of the first major projects to come to Rock Island. Now, for those of you who are really interested in this, and I've got 3 of you here, so you're going to see me point. But for those of you at home, I need you to imagine that you're looking behind the little black box over here, and you're looking at the column that's closest to you on the right side. That is approximately where the horse in the museum it was located. So this is actually a picture of Building 60. And this is also one of the buildings where the 1903 program was located. It was located between here and Building 68. One of the wonderful things that we have about Building 68 is the 1903 program got to be so big that we had to build 2 new quarters. We had to build quarters 6 and quarter 7. Well, Building 68 also happens to be where 1st Army headquarters is today, and quarter 6 is where the military commander for the 1903 program stayed. It's also now where 1st Army's commander lives. So 1st Army has a lot of connections to the 1903 program, and that Building 68 is still connected with quarter 6. At its peak, it did require both civilian and military oversight, as mentioned. So quarter 7 is where the civilian would have stayed. And the project saw about 100,000 1903s produced at Rock Island during this time, and many more were actually repaired. Now, what I want to emphasize is that this 100,000 number is a pre-war number, does not include the wartime production values. This is going to be hard for those of you who are here to see, but this is actually one of the drawings that we have of the 1903. More so just to display that these are what the drawings look like. But as far as ammo pouches, cases, rifles, rifle racks, and more were produced during this time. So if anybody's been at the arsenal, you might have seen a stop sign that in a very odd location, or you might have seen like a brochure holder that was totally not put out by my office. And you might want to take a closer look at those brochure holders or those inconspicuous stop signs, because they are not on regular poles. They are on 1903 Springfield rifle racks. That's what they're mounted on. Stargazing and rifling took place in Building 68, and much of this was actually performed by women ordnance workers. So once again, bringing that whole thing in about women workers coming out of secretarial duties and into skilled labor. Yes, sir.
So what is stargazing?
Stargazing has to do with the rifling method inside the rifle. So making sure that the rifling is actually set to standard. And we actually have pictures of that on one of these slides here, so you'll be able to take a look. Next thing that comes into Rock Island is the 1910 infantry and the 1912 cavalry equipment boards. So this is actually an example of one of the equipment sets back here. So socks, haversacks, eating utensils, meat cans, canteens. A soldier would carry on them. That comes to Rock Island. That's one of the things that Rock Island is responsible for. And the shops on Armory Row produce the material that would accompany that soldier pretty much everywhere. So here's actually an example of one of the 1910 equipment sets right there. This is generally what forces were using in the punitive expedition in World War I. However, I doubt that every single soldier had this. Actually, I'm sure that not every single soldier had this when World War I came around. They were probably still using an older equipment set. However, these are slowly being phased in by the time we get into World War I. So we start to see it become a little bit more common as we get further down the road. The leather and tin works were crucial to that. So the shops in Armory Row virtually never ceased to run, even in the interwar period between the Spanish War and World War I. So cavalry kit is exhibited here. It's actually one of the cavalry kits that I believe was actually on display up with the horse at the museum. And don't worry, I'm pretty sure the horse is coming back. At least I think he is. We just might have to figure out a way to make him less radioactive than he currently is because of the arsenic. But anyway, so this is one of the examples of kits that came out during this time. I don't know for sure if this is, like I said, I don't know for sure if that's the exact same one, but it's pretty close to the kit that went to the World's Fair as well. So we talk about the arsenal record from 62 through 1914. Rodman does write that there are 55,000 pieces of equipment that run through the arsenal by 1869. 500 of those are artillery, such as what's shown here. Depot activities began almost immediately in 1865, and then of course 1871 through 1893, the arsenal is focused on building the buildings. So we do have things that are going on in the shops. By and large, we're focusing on actually constructing the footprint that's going to be the arsenal at large. Non-wartime orders, there were about 3,000 saddles that come through starting in 1875 and 160 stoves, which is great because if you read any of the descriptions on the stoves, they're supposed to be portable stoves. They might be portable if you're He-Man. These are huge, these are heavy duty stoves. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen any of the tall black stoves. They stand about yay high up to your waist or maybe a little bit higher. They weigh a ton, but they are super duper cool. But we made 160 of those here. The smithy and foundry in building 106 and building 64 both operate from 1873 when they're completed all the way through Project Rearm in 1988. So those buildings are constantly having machinery in them and being upgraded and people working on them through 1988 when Rearm comes through, modernizes and streamlines everything, and then kicks everything off to the modern factory that we know of today. Field artillery and leather goods plants, those are updated in 1913, largely because the amount of requests that are coming in and the orders that are coming in are just too much for the current machinery that are in there. So we do eventually get upgraded leather works and leather and field artillery machinery that come through. And then finally, on the eve of World War I, we've only dropped to about 1,900 personnel from our wartime high of 2,900s. And this is the figure in 1917, not 1914. So we're gonna bring this right up to about the spin up of World War I here. One of the things that the arsenal is really good at is building buildings. So a lot of the larger conflicts that we see, you'll see a lot of buildings being built. And World War I was no exception to that. So this map here actually shows what the arsenal looked like in 1923. This is a 1923 map. Not all 4 of these locations are all of the expansion. There's actually a little bit more expansion between these 2 boxes here, but the red outlines show the bulk of where the expansions were. The yellow denotes storage space. The blue denotes machine space, where new factory material buildings were actually constructed. So we have the beginnings of the modern factory were constructed during this time. The artillery setting plant, most of the old storehouses, like where our PX or NWR and things like that are today, those were constructed at that time. And some of these extra buildings back here, those were all constructed just before and leading into World War I. So a lot of this had to do with modernizing and making the capacity for Rock Island Arsenal just be better. We were also getting large amounts of material back, and we were preparing for large amounts of material to come back as well. So the need for storage space was increasing exponentially. As we keep going down, we started seeing that there's a need for skilled craftsmen to be at the ready at all times. Again, going back to the skilled craftsman training that we talked about at the beginning of this. The spin-up of production after 1 April 1917 was easy-ish. There's always hiccups when you're going from 0 to 60. I'm not saying that there weren't any hiccups, but by and large, at Rock Island, we were able to get into wartime production much more fluidly than maybe some of the other arsenals were. And in addition, Rock Island had already proven itself with the recoil mechanisms, and carriages and rifles and everything like that. So eventually we do restart things with the 1903 program. The arsenal will actually send skilled laborers over to France to actually do research on the French 75 gun systems and the recoil mechanisms that are over there, and they'll bring them back and we'll implement a way to do mass production of these recoil mechanisms. Recoil mechanisms are things that Rock Island Arsenal has been good at since then. So this is something that we've kind of retained to this time. Now, one of the things I also centralized location, it's been able to ship out things, that being things that can be put on a train and sent to either coast, and then they get drop shipped wherever a soldier needs it. They were doing that during the Spanish-American War. So the cannons that we were showing you on the one page where they're being loaded on a ship, that is coming off of a train that was sent to it probably from either Rock Island or Watervliet, being sent down and loaded onto a ship to be kicked over to Cuba. And one of my favorite pictures here in the background, but World War I, and this is going to be very brief that we go over World War I because that's going to be our next talk, but I have to kind of moisten the palate just a little bit to make people come back. And that's kind of what this is, make sure that you all come back. World War I was actually the only time that we were doing artillery shell filling at Rock Island Arsenal. Much of that was being done by women. It's an extremely dangerous job. And the fuse setting on those was also done by women. Some of those women were also African-American women as well. So a lot of things happening there a little bit ahead of the time. The 1903 program restarted, as I mentioned, and star gauging of rifles. So they are actually star gauging right here. It's a picture of them star gauging. So the rifle's laying right here, and they're going to run this through to just basically make sure that the rifling is proper. French 75 guns were something that we were also helping with assembly, recoil mechanisms. We expanded the storage facilities to give you a better idea of that. Actually, I think I have that figure on the next slide, but we expanded it by about 4 times over our storage size capacity, just on the installation. That doesn't include Savannah Proving Ground that we also had acquired. Manufacturing capabilities had expanded. We had that whole new wing that we had added, which is what we now modernly know as the Kingsbury Complex. That gets added at the time. Gas and supply, gun and supply carriages, recoil mechanisms. Eventually, we'll also get the Mark 8 tanks. Those will come after the war, but that is considered a World War I mission. Something else that I want to put in here too is that while this is all going on, we're updating the infrastructure of the island. So we're upgrading like electrical, sewer, water, roadways, things like that to all make things a lot more streamlined, because once World War I does kick off, the Arsenal's workforce actually will increase to almost 15,000 by the end of the war in 1918. So there's over $89 million that was spent by the Arsenal during World War I. 12 million feet of space is added. 12 million feet. That, again, that doesn't include Savannah. About 167,000 155 shells, 113,000 Springfields, and then of course our 100 Mark 8 tanks, which we are getting one back, I promise. That will happen eventually. And the Arsenal contracted with over 200 additional businesses. Again, this is going back to this thing of contracting. We have been very good at contracting out to get either material resources in or additional manpower in to meet the needs. And this is what we were even still doing at this time. So this is an example of our 155 shells. These are 155s that are ready to be shipped out. They're being inspected and loaded up. So we haven't done it since, largely because it's not the best idea. You don't want to have an ammo plant near a populated space. It's not a great place for one. The need was so high that the Arsenal did produce them during this time. And of course, we have our fancy Mark 8 tank here, which is something, it's a labor of love, in my opinion, but it's just a giant hunk of metal that would slowly just race its way across the battlefield as it's moving from one side to the other. So with that, though, a couple of things that I want to point out is that we do have our self-guided tours, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We also do tours of quarters 1 with MWR now. That phone number is on the screen. So if you want to actually get into quarters 1, you have a chance to do that. Give quarters 1 or MWR a phone call. They normally run those on Saturdays. The next talk is going to be talking about World Wars I and II, which I think is one of the most fascinating periods of Arsenal history. That's just me. But that's going to be our next subject of talk. So we're going to be talking about production numbers, women in the workforce. We're also going to be talking about how awesome the production output was of the Arsenal at that time, local community support for the Arsenal, as well as how the Arsenal supported the community back, including things like housing and things like that, and how the Arsenal actually influenced and shaped housing in the Plant City area. So